Why does fear move so quickly through the mind, while truth arrives slowly, almost as if it has to fight its way through the noise? You wake up and reach for your phone before your mind is fully awake. The room is quiet, but the screen is already loud. A notification, then another, a headline sliding across your feed, something alarming, something urgent, something that feels like it demands your attention. Immediately, you wake up and reach for your phone before your mind is fully awake. The room is quiet, but the screen is already loud. A notification, then another, a headline sliding across your feed, something alarming, something urgent, something that feels like it demands your attention immediately. You read a few lines, and before you even finish the article, you feel it. A subtle tightening in your chest. A vague sense that something is wrong. Maybe it's the economy collapsing again. Maybe it's a new crisis. Maybe it's something about technology replacing jobs, or another conflict somewhere far away. The details barely matter. What matters is the feeling that spreads through you before your mind has time to examine it. And the strange part is this: you didn't go looking for fear, it arrived. It always arrives quickly, faster than you expect, faster than you can process. And once it's there, it lingers. The mind begins to fill the gaps. What if this gets worse? What if it affects my future? What if I'm already behind and didn't realize it? What if everyone else knows something I don't? You scroll further, hoping to understand more, but instead you find more of the same. More urgency, more alarm, more tension, each voice claiming to tell you the truth, each one sounding certain. But the feeling grows heavier, and somewhere inside you, a quiet thought begins to form. Why does this spread so easily? Why does fear travel so quickly through people, through conversations, through entire societies? And why does truth seem slower, quieter, harder to find? You notice it in everyday moments. You sit with friends and someone mentions a rumor about layoffs at their company. Within minutes, the tone of the conversation changes. Speculation fills the room. Someone heard something from someone else. Another person adds a detail they're not fully sure about. No one verifies anything, yet the tension becomes real. You leave the table feeling slightly unsettled. Later, you discover the rumor wasn't true, but the emotion it created was real. The worry was real. The sleepless nights someone had because of it was real. Fear moved faster than the truth ever had a chance to, and this is not a modern problem alone. Long before social media, long before algorithms learned how to capture human attention, the Stoics had already observed something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. We are not naturally drawn to calm reasoning. We are drawn to what threatens us, because the human brain was built for survival, long before it was built for clarity. Thousands of years ago, noticing danger quickly could save your life. The rustling in the bushes might be a predator. The strange sound at night might signal something approaching. Missing those signals could be fatal, so the mind evolved to prioritize. Alarm, not balance, not patience, alarm. And even though the world has changed, the mind still operates by the same ancient instincts. This is why a frightening rumor spreads through an office faster than a calm explanation. Why a dramatic headline spreads faster than a measured analysis. Why a negative comment online gathers more attention than a thoughtful reflection. Fear activates something deep inside us. It bypasses the slow, reflective part of the mind and moves straight into the emotional center. It feels urgent. It feels important. It feels like something you must respond to immediately, but urgency is not the same as truth, and yet many people live as if it is. You can see it in small moments if you pay attention. A message from a friend that simply says, "We need to talk." Suddenly your mind fills with possibilities. Maybe they're upset. Maybe you did something wrong. Maybe the relationship is about to change. You haven't asked for clarification yet. You haven't heard the truth, but your mind has already constructed an entire emotional story. Fear is efficient at writing narratives. Truth is slower. Truth waits for evidence. Truth waits for context. But fear does not wait. And this creates a quiet kind of suffering that many people carry without fully understanding it. You might notice it when you lie awake at night thinking about a conversation that happened earlier in the day. Someone's tone sounded slightly different. A colleague seemed distant. A message was shorter than usual. The mind fills in the blanks again. Maybe they're angry. Maybe they're judging me. Maybe something is wrong. But the next morning you discover nothing was wrong at all. They were just tired, busy, distracted. Still, the emotional turbulence you experienced the night before was real. Fear created an entire storm inside your mind without needing much evidence, and when you start noticing this pattern, something unsettling begins to emerge. Much of what people react to every day isn't reality, it's interpretation, it's imagination, it's the mind responding to signals that may not actually represent danger. This doesn't mean people are weak or irrational. It means they are human. But understanding this changes something important, because once you see how quickly fear moves through people, you begin to see it everywhere. You see it in group conversations where one anxious voice sets the emotional tone for everyone else. You see it in online discussions where outrage spreads faster than thoughtful dialogue. You see it in workplaces where uncertainty becomes contagious. One person expresses worry, and suddenly everyone feels it. Not because the worry is accurate, but because the emotion spreads. The Stoic philosopher Seneca once observed something deeply simple but powerful. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. And when you pause long enough to reflect on your own life, you may realize how often this is true. Think about a time when you anticipated something terrible. A difficult conversation, a possible rejection, an uncertain outcome. You replayed the scenario in your mind again and again. You felt tension building for days, and then the moment finally arrived. Sometimes it turned out to be manageable. Sometimes it wasn't even a problem at all. Yet the suffering you experienced before the event had already consumed your energy. Fear had already done its work. And if you look closely, you might notice something else. Fear rarely arrives alone. It invites more of itself. One worry creates another. One anxious thought opens the door to 5 more. Soon the mind becomes crowded with possibilities that may never happen. Meanwhile, truth moves differently. Truth doesn't shout. Truth doesn't rush. Truth often appears quietly after the emotional storm has already passed. And because of that, many people miss it. They react to the first wave of fear before truth has time to surface. This is one of the quiet tragedies of the modern world. Information moves faster than wisdom, emotion travels faster than reflection, and fear spreads faster than truth. But the deeper problem is not outside of you. It lives inside. The way the mind processes uncertainty, because when you don't know something, the mind doesn't like the empty space, so it fills it often with the worst possibility, not because you want suffering, but because the brain believes preparing for danger will protect you. The strange irony is that this instinct, which once helped humans survive in harsh environments, now often creates unnecessary distress in everyday life. And if you're honest with yourself, you've probably felt it. That moment when your mind jumps ahead of reality, when you assume the worst before you have enough information, when a single message, a single rumor, or a single thought. There is a moment most people recognize, though they rarely pause long enough to examine it. It happens in ordinary places, in offices, in living rooms, in group chats that never seem to sleep. Someone shares a piece of information that sounds uncertain but alarming. It might be about layoffs at a company, a market crash, a health scare, a relationship rumor, or a political decision that could change everything. No one knows the full story yet, but the reaction begins immediately. Messages multiply. Opinions form. Predictions appear. Within minutes, the emotional temperature rises. There is a moment most people recognize, though they rarely pause long enough to examine it. It happens in ordinary places, in offices, in living rooms, in group chats that never seem to sleep. Someone shares a piece of information that sounds uncertain but alarming. It might be about layoffs at a company, a market crash, a health scare, a relationship rumor, or a political decision that could change everything. No one knows the full story yet, but the reaction begins immediately. Messages multiply. Opinions form. Predictions appear. Within minutes, the emotional temperature rises. You watch it happen maybe. You even participate without realizing it. A colleague forwards an article and writes, "This doesn't look good." Another person adds, "I heard something similar last week." Someone else says, "My friend in another department said they're already preparing for cuts." None of these statements contain confirmed facts. Yet by the time the conversation ends, the room feels heavier than before. People go home carrying a quiet sense of threat. And later, days or weeks later, the full picture emerges. The layoffs never happened. The rumor was based on a misinterpreted email. The situation was far less dramatic than everyone imagined. But during those hours of uncertainty, fear had already traveled through the group, and no one stopped it. This is one of the strange dynamics of human behavior. Fear rarely spreads through malicious intent. Most of the time, it spreads through ordinary people trying to protect themselves. When the mind senses uncertainty, it tries to reduce it. But instead of waiting patiently for clarity, it fills the unknown with speculation. Speculation feels like preparation. It feels like staying informed. But often, it's simply the mind trying to escape discomfort. You see this pattern in personal relationships too. Imagine someone you care about becoming slightly distant for a few days. Their responses are shorter. Their tone seems different. They cancel a plan you were both looking forward to. Your mind begins to work. Maybe they're losing interest. Maybe they're upset about something you said. Maybe the relationship is changing in ways you can't control. None of these conclusions are confirmed, yet the emotional response becomes real. You replay conversations in your mind. You search for clues in past messages. You begin to interpret small details as signs of something larger. Days later, you finally speak openly, and the explanation is simple. They were overwhelmed with work. They were dealing with something personal. Their distance had nothing to do with you, and suddenly, the tension disappears. But the emotional storm that happened before that conversation was entirely created by the mind, trying to fill a gap in knowledge. This is where the deeper human conflict begins. The mind wants certainty, but life rarely offers it quickly, and when certainty doesn't arrive, the ego steps in. The ego does not like uncertainty because uncertainty makes you feel powerless. It reminds you that not everything is under your control. So the ego tries to regain control by constructing explanations. Even if those explanations are built on incomplete information, the mind says, "I must figure this out now," and fear becomes the tool it uses. The Stoics noticed this long before modern psychology began studying cognitive bias and emotional contagion. They observed something deeply uncomfortable about the way human beings respond to impressions. Epictetus once said that people are disturbed not by things themselves, but by the views they take of them. At first glance, this sounds abstract. But when you observe real situations in your own life, its meaning becomes clearer. Consider someone checking their phone late at night and seeing a message from their manager that reads, "Can we talk tomorrow morning?" Immediately, the mind reacts. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe something went wrong with the project. Maybe this conversation will affect my position. The body responds too. The heart rate rises slightly. Sleep becomes harder, but the message itself contains no threat. It contains a request for a conversation. Everything else is interpretation, yet interpretation feels real because the mind creates emotional responses before verifying the facts. The Stoics understood that the first impression that enters your mind is not something you fully control. The mind reacts quickly to stimuli. It generates images, predictions, possibilities. This initial reaction is natural. Matters is what happens next. Most people accept that first impression as truth. They let it guide their emotions and their actions. But the Stoics practiced something different. They paused. They examined the impression before agreeing with it. They treated the mind's first reaction not as a command, but as a suggestion. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this constantly in his private reflections. As a Roman emperor surrounded by political tension, war, and endless rumors, he had every reason to react emotionally to every piece of alarming information that reached him. But instead, he reminded himself again and again, you have power over your mind, not outside events. This statement is often misunderstood as a motivational phrase, but its meaning is much deeper. Marcus was not saying that external events don't matter. Wars mattered. Betrayal mattered. Illness mattered. But what he recognized was that the mind often multiplies suffering by reacting to impressions before understanding them. In other words, the mind turns possibilities into emotional realities, and once fear becomes emotionally real, it spreads. Think about how often this happens in modern life. You open social media and see hundreds of reactions to a headline before the full story is even available. People share opinions instantly. Some express outrage. Others express despair. The emotional tone spreads across thousands of screens. By the time careful analysis appears hours later, the emotional reaction has already shaped how people interpret the information. Truth arrives slowly. Fear has already traveled. But the deeper problem is not technology. Technology simply amplifies something that already exists within human psychology. That real conflict happens inside the individual mind. When you hear something uncertain, you face a quiet choice. You can follow the immediate emotional reaction, or you can pause and question it. Most people never pause, not because they are careless, but because reacting quickly feels safer. If something dangerous might be happening, reacting immediately feels responsible. Waiting feels risky. But this instinct, while useful in moments of real physical danger, often creates unnecessary suffering in situations that require patience rather than alarm. A small example makes this clear. Imagine a friend who normally responds to your messages within minutes. One evening you send a message, and at some point, if you observe your own mind carefully enough, a strange realization begins to appear. Fear does not usually arrive as a clear statement. It rarely says, "This is only a possibility." Instead, it presents itself as something that feels almost certain. The mind quietly replaces the phrase, "This might happen," with "This is probably happening." And in that subtle shift, emotion takes control before reason has time to speak. At some point, if you observe your own mind carefully enough, a strange realization begins to appear. Fear does not usually arrive as a clear statement. It rarely says, "This is only a possibility." Instead, it presents itself as something that feels almost certain. The mind quietly replaces the phrase, "This might happen," with "This is probably happening." And in that subtle shift, Emotion takes control before reason has time to speak. You might notice it in small, ordinary moments. You send an important email and don't receive a reply for several hours. A thought appears. Maybe they didn't like what I wrote. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe this will affect the project. Your body reacts before you verify anything. A mild tension settles in your stomach. You check your inbox again. Still nothing. Hours later, the response arrives. Sorry for the delay. Busy afternoon. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing changed. Yet your mind spent hours living inside a story that never existed. When you begin to recognize how often this happens, something quietly humbling emerges. The mind is not always a reliable narrator of reality. It is a storyteller, and when it encounters uncertainty, it writes the fastest story it can. Fear simply happens to be the easiest story to tell. This is where the Stoic perspective becomes surprisingly practical. The Stoics were not trying to eliminate emotions entirely, as many people assume. They understood that emotions arise naturally. What they focused on instead was the moment between the first impression and the mind's agreement with it. That small moment is where your freedom exists. Epictetus described it as the discipline of assent. The idea was simple but powerful. When an impression enters your mind, you do not have to accept it immediately as truth. You can pause. You can examine it. You can ask whether it deserves your belief. Most people never practice this pause. Modern life moves too quickly. Messages arrive constantly. News travels instantly. Opinions flood every conversation. The mind begins to mirror the pace of the environment. It reacts, interprets, judges, predicts. But reacting quickly is not the same as thinking clearly. In fact, the faster the reaction, the more likely it is driven by emotion rather than understanding. Consider how people behave when a sudden piece of alarming news spreads online. Within minutes, thousands of comments appear. Some express anger. Some express despair. Others share the information without even checking its accuracy. By the time verified facts appear, the emotional narrative has already taken shape. People rarely retract the emotion. They felt first even if the truth contradicts it. This is not because people are dishonest. It is because the mind becomes attached to the story it creates. Once fear has shaped your interpretation of an event, letting go of that fear requires admitting that your first reaction may have been mistaken. And the ego resists that. The ego prefers certainty, even when the certainty is uncomfortable. This is why the Stoic mindset feels so different from the modern emotional rhythm. Modern behavior often rewards immediate reaction. People admire quick opinions, strong responses, dramatic certainty. But the Stoics practiced something quieter. They slowed down their agreement with the mind. Marcus Aurelius wrote Reflections to himself, reminding his mind not to be carried away by appearances. He understood that the first version of a situation that appears in your mind is rarely the full truth. It is simply an impression. Imagine a person walking into a meeting where several colleagues suddenly stop talking when they enter the room. The mind reacts immediately. They were talking about me. Something must be wrong. Maybe there's a problem I don't know about. That interpretation creates an emotional shift in seconds. The body becomes tense. The tone of the conversation changes. The person becomes cautious, guarded, maybe even defensive. Later it turns out the colleagues were discussing a surprise birthday plan. The emotional reaction was based entirely on interpretation. But during those moments, the feeling of threat felt real. This is the silent power of the mind's first impression. It shapes your emotional world before reality has a chance to reveal itself. The Stoic insight was not that you should never experience these impressions. That would be impossible. The mind reacts automatically. What they taught was that you can choose whether to endorse the impression. That choice requires awareness, and awareness requires stillness. This is where the contrast between modern behavior and Stoic practice becomes clear. Modern life trains the mind to move quickly from stimulus to reaction. You see something, you respond. You hear something, you react. The cycle repeats all day, but the Stoic mind inserts a gap, a small space between the event and the emotional conclusion. In that space, something important happens. Clarity begins to form. Imagine hearing a rumor about your company preparing for layoffs. The first reaction might be anxiety. That reaction is natural. But instead of immediately accepting the fear as truth, the Stoic mind asks questions. What do I actually know right now? What evidence supports this rumor? What evidence contradicts it? Is my reaction based on facts or speculation? These questions slow down the emotional chain reaction that fear tries to create. They do not eliminate uncertainty, but they prevent the mind from multiplying it. And this is where a deeper emotional shift begins to happen. When you practice examining your impressions instead of immediately believing them, you begin to reclaim something that many people lose without realizing it: your internal stability. Most emotional chaos is not caused by events themselves. It is caused by the mind rushing to interpret those events. Before enough information exists, fear spreads quickly, because interpretation spreads quickly. But when you slow down that interpretation, something remarkable happens. The emotional intensity begins to soften. You notice that many of the things that once triggered immediate worry are actually unresolved situations, not confirmed problems. A delayed response from someone is not rejection. A rumor is not a confirmed threat. A strange tone in a conversation is not necessarily hostility. These distinctions may sound simple, but they change the entire emotional landscape of daily life. Because there is a quiet moment that begins to appear once you truly understand how fear travels through the mind. It usually arrives in an ordinary situation, not a dramatic one. Nothing extraordinary is happening. You are simply standing in the middle of a moment that once would have unsettled you. There is a quiet moment that begins to appear once you truly understand how fear travels through the mind. It usually arrives in an ordinary situation, not a dramatic one. Nothing extraordinary is happening. You are simply standing in the middle of a moment that once would have unsettled you. Maybe someone sends a message that feels slightly cold. Maybe you hear a rumor about something changing at work. Maybe someone speaks to you with a tone that your mind could easily interpret as criticism. In the past, the reaction would have been automatic. Your mind would start building explanations before you even noticed it happening. You would replay the moment, analyze every word, look for hidden meaning. But now something different occurs. The thought appears, then you pause. Not because you are suppressing emotion, not because you are pretending everything is fine, but because you have begun to recognize the difference between an event and your interpretation of it. This small pause is where the Stoic practice becomes real. It is not a philosophy that lives in books. It lives in that quiet space between what happens and what your mind decides it means. Most people never see that space because they move too quickly through it. But when you slow down enough to notice it, you realize something important. Emotional chaos rarely begins with reality. It begins with the story the mind creates about reality, and stories can be questioned. Imagine a very simple example. You walk past a group of co-workers and they stop talking as you approach. The mind immediately reacts. They were talking about me. Something must be wrong. This reaction happens in seconds. It feels almost automatic. But now you catch the moment. You pause. You ask a simple internal question. Do I actually know that? The answer is no. Maybe they were discussing something private. Maybe the conversation simply ended naturally. Maybe the pause had nothing to do with you at all. The moment you ask that question, something subtle changes. The emotional reaction loses its certainty. The mind is no longer convinced that its first interpretation is correct. And because the certainty fades, the anxiety fades with it. This is not a trick. It is not positive thinking. It is simply refusing to let the mind declare conclusions without evidence. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly. As a leader responsible for an empire filled with political tension, military pressure, and constant rumors, he could not afford to react emotionally to every impression that reached him, so he trained himself to examine events carefully before responding to them internally. He reminded himself that many things people fear are not events themselves, but judgments about those events, and judgments can be revised. When you apply this mindset to daily life, something interesting begins to happen. Situations that once felt overwhelming start to look different. Take the experience of receiving criticism. For many people, criticism immediately triggers defensiveness or shame. The mind translates criticism into something personal. They think I'm incompetent. They don't respect me. This means I'm failing. But a Stoic approach begins by separating the event from the meaning. Attached to it, someone gives feedback. That is the event. Everything else is interpretation. Once you separate those two things, you gain the ability to respond more calmly. Maybe the criticism contains something useful. Maybe it doesn't. But the emotional reaction no longer controls the moment. You examine it. you decide how much of it deserves your attention, and then you move forward. This practice becomes even more powerful in situations where uncertainty normally creates anxiety. Imagine waiting to hear the result of a job application or an important decision. In the past, your mind might have replayed every possibility repeatedly. What if they reject me? What if I made a mistake during the interview? What if this opportunity disappears? The mind tries to resolve the uncertainty by imagining outcomes, but those imagined outcomes create emotional turbulence. Stoic approach does something simpler. You remind yourself of a clear distinction. Some things are within your control, and some things are not. Your preparation for the interview was within your control. Your behavior during the conversation was within your control. The final decision is not. Once the event is finished, worrying about the outcome does not improve it. It only drains your attention from the present moment. This does not mean you become indifferent to results. It means you refuse to let your peace depend entirely on them. And this shift reduces an enormous amount of unnecessary emotional strain, because much of what people call stress is actually the mind trying to control things that have already left its hands. The Stoics practiced returning their attention to what remained within their influence, their actions, their character, their response to events. Everything else was acknowledged, but not allowed to dominate their inner world. Begin to see how powerful this becomes in everyday life. When someone behaves unpredictably, instead of trying to control their behavior, you focus on your own response. When uncertainty appears, instead of filling it with fearful stories, you allow it to remain uncertain until more information arrives. When rumors circulate, instead of immediately absorbing the emotional tone around you, you step back and observe before reacting. These are not dramatic changes. They are quiet adjustments in how the mind processes the world. But over time, they create something remarkable. The emotional noise around you becomes easier to navigate. You start noticing how often people react to impressions without examining them. Conversations become less overwhelming because you are no longer pulled into every wave of speculation or anxiety. You begin to move through situations with a steadiness that others may find surprising, not because you know more than they do, but because you have stopped letting uncertainty dictate your emotional state. There is a certain calm that appears. When the mind learns this discipline, it is not the calm of someone who believes nothing bad will happen. Life remains unpredictable, difficult. Things still occur, but the calm comes from understanding that your mind does not have to amplify every uncertain moment into a crisis. It can wait, it can observe, it can respond thoughtfully rather than reflexively. And when you practice this long enough, you begin to notice something even deeper. Fear still appears, but it no longer spreads through your mind. There is a quiet moment. There is a quiet transformation that happens when you begin living this way long enough. There is a quiet transformation that happens when you begin living this way long enough. It is not dramatic. No one announces it. The world around you does not suddenly become peaceful or predictable. The same rumors still circulate. The same alarming headlines still appear. The same uncertainties continue to move through conversations, workplaces, and relationships. But something inside you begins to move differently. Where fear once rushed in and filled the space immediately, there is now a pause, a breath, a moment of stillness before reaction. And in that stillness, you begin to notice something that most people overlook. Much of the noise that once dominated your emotional life was never truly yours. It was borrowed from conversations filled with speculation, borrowed from headlines designed to trigger urgency, borrowed from the anxieties of other people who were themselves reacting to uncertainty. Fear spreads quickly because people pass it to each other without realizing it. A worried tone becomes contagious. A dramatic interpretation becomes the new reality of the group. A single alarming possibility becomes the dominant narrative in a room. But once you see this process clearly, it becomes harder for that contagion to enter your mind in the same way. You begin to observe fear instead of absorbing it. Imagine sitting with a group of friends while someone shares a dramatic rumor about the future of your industry. In the past, you might have felt the tension immediately. Your mind would have begun calculating risks, imagining outcomes, searching for signs that the threat was real. Now the moment feels different. You listen. You notice the uncertainty in the information. You notice how quickly people around you begin to build conclusions. But instead of joining the emotional momentum, you stay grounded. You ask simple questions. How reliable is this information? What do we actually know right now? What parts of this are assumptions? Often, the room grows quieter when someone asks those questions, because the emotional wave was built on momentum, not clarity. And when clarity enters the conversation, the wave loses strength. This does not mean you become detached from the world. Stoicism was never about indifference. The Stoics cared deeply about responsibility, integrity, and thoughtful action. What they refused to do was surrender their inner stability to every uncertain signal that appeared. Marcus Aurelius spent his life surrounded by chaos, political rivals, war on the borders, betrayal inside the empire, illness that followed him for years. Yet his writings reveal a mind that constantly returned to a simple discipline. Examine the impression, separate the event from the story. The mind attaches to it. Respond with reason rather than reaction. This discipline creates something rare in modern life: emotional sovereignty. Most people live as if their emotional state is determined by what happens around them. If the news feels alarming, they feel anxious. If a rumor spreads through the office, they feel uneasy. If someone speaks harshly, their entire mood shifts. Their inner world becomes a mirror of external events. But the Stoic path leads somewhere different. It leads to a place where the mind becomes a filter rather than a mirror. Events still arrive. Information still reaches you, but before it shapes your emotional state, it passes through reflection. Is this confirmed? Is my reaction helpful? Is this something within my control? These questions act like quiet guardians at the entrance of your mind. They slow the spread of fear, and over time, something surprising begins to happen. Your mind becomes quieter, not empty, not indifferent, but less crowded with imagined threats. When uncertainty appears, it no longer automatically turns into anxiety. It simply remains uncertainty until reality clarifies it. And because of that, you begin to experience a kind of mental space that many people rarely feel. Space between events and emotional reaction. Space between rumor and belief. Space between possibility and fear. In that space, your attention returns to something much more stable: your character, your actions, your choices in the present moment. The Stoics believed that the only true possession a person has is their ability to choose their response to life. Everything else, status, reputation, wealth, even health, can change without warning. But the discipline of the mind remains yours. And when you protect that discipline, you begin to move through the world with a quiet authority, not loud confidence, not aggressive certainty, but a calm presence that does not rush to judgment. People notice it. They may not always understand it, but they notice. In conversations where emotions escalate quickly, you remain measured. When others panic over possibilities, you ask thoughtful questions. When uncertainty appears, you do not immediately surrender your peace to it. This is not because you are immune to fear. You are human, but fear still visits the mind, but it no longer governs it. You examine it, you let it speak, and then you decide whether it deserves your belief. This is what inner sovereignty looks like. Not control over the world, control over the doorway of your own mind. And when you live this way long enough, something subtle but profound begins to happen. The world feels less chaotic, not because chaos disappeared, but because your mind stopped amplifying it. Fear still spreads quickly among people. That is part of human nature. But inside you, something slower and steadier begins to take root. Clarity, patience, perspective, and those qualities move differently than fear. They do not rush, they do not shout. They simply remain quiet, stable, unmoved by every passing storm. And in that quiet stability, you begin to understand something. The Stoics knew thousands of years ago, the greatest power a person can have is not the ability to control events, it is the ability to remain steady when events try to control them. So, the next time fear moves quickly through a conversation, a headline, or a rumor that seems urgent, pause for a moment. Notice the speed at which the mind wants to react. Notice the story beginning to form, and before accepting that story as truth, allow yourself a single breath of distance. Sometimes, that single breath is enough to let truth catch up.